growing up, as a Canadian of South Asian descent, certainly, I would say that, there is a sense of death phobia that exists in our culture and culturally, and talking about death and dying. Maybe, after death, from a religious perspective, there's certainly a lot of talk about that. Went to many funerals, there were many ceremonies. That was very part and parcel. But the part where people were dying didn't get talked about a lot, got avoided a lot. And what that unfortunately means is that advanced care planning is not part and parcel of a lot of the conversations, a lot of the journeys that many people are going through. And with aging demographics, that's unfortunate, because we know that advanced care planning is so important to, for people to plan their wishes when they get sick, what they would want if they ended up in hospital. And while we cannot predict an infinite number of things that someone would go through, advanced care planning is, again, a tool in your toolbox to really plan for the future, plan for the inevitable. And so I think that was like really something that really stuck out. It's interesting now that I work in palliative care, doing events like this, it's like going full circle. It's an opportunity to give back culturally and enrich an already very rich culture, to be, less death phobic. I think that's the theme I'm going to really focus on. Race and, systemic racism, and diversity and culture play a huge role in who's accessing and not accessing palliative care. And there's no doubt in our South Asian community and communities, the diaspora, where we are around the world, we are not talking about the issues of palliative care. We are not talking about aging. We are not talking about death and dying. And unfortunately, that means that people aren't getting the care and the resources they necessarily need. So, that's a little bit of my story. Aditi, you've worked very hard on this vision for the Center for Conscious Living and Dying. Can you tell us a bit about that and what that is, first of all, and how you got there?
Yeah. Yeah, I could listen to you talk about your story forever, but I'll dive in. Um, so similarly, the immigrant culture, my community coming, to the States, there was very much this ideal of the American dream, and through whether it's any kind of secure job, engineering, physician, medical or other. And when I was 17, I heard of hospice for the first time at a college fair, and I was surprised. I was shocked that I'd never heard of hospice before. And I'd grown up in a community of physicians, and I had been to India and seen death so integrated into life, and then coming back to the States, it was always surprising how siloed everything was, and how individualistic we were, and how hush hush we were about illness and death. And I started volunteering for hospice when I was 17, and so I'm 41 now, so that's almost 20 plus years ago. And then that experience, I ended up studying religious studies in undergrad and medical humanities. So I was always kind of drawn to the bigger questions of why, what are we doing here? And I also love the science of medicine. So bringing those two together in hospice seemed like a good fit. And as a hospice volunteer, I got to really be present with people who were dying and experience the whole spectrum of suffering that I witnessed. And throughout so I'm going to jump around here, but in one of my Eastern religion classes, my professor talked about Varanasi, one of the oldest towns in India, maybe the oldest, where these funeral pyres, these crematory pyres, are just 24/7 are burning, and with dead bodies, and there's so much ritual and ceremony around it, and then the cremated remains are thrown in the Ganges, where people are bathing and children are swimming, and it's just so part of the cycle of life, and it's so integrated. And I was still fascinated by the difference with what I'd seen with death in America, and to this day am. So ritual, kind of the approach to death that allows families and children to really be a part of that process, has always been fascinating to me.
I worked for several years in a South Asian community, Brampton, Ontario, Peel, providing care for a significant population of South Asians in our community. And some of the things that really resonated, that you already mentioned, was the fact that a lot of people were not ready to have the conversation. That the P word in really inspired fear actually in people. And actually, I'm just going to share that, this led me to do some research, and I just put the link in the chat. I realized that there had actually never been a study, talking to people who were South Asian who were in need of palliative care about their perceptions of palliative care. I felt that was step zero before even step one. And so we did the study for basically 2 years, talking to South Asians who were in need of palliative care at our institution, our hospital. And, it was really an eye-opening experience. I mean, we even designed the framework of the study to be patient-directed, but a lot of the time, family members, South Asian family members, wouldn't even let us talk to family. They would shield their loved ones and be protective. And I think it was very apparent, even in the study methodology when we were doing it, that family members play a huge role, and the family unit is often very large, and multiple people play a role, and there's a strong desire to keep people at home for as long as possible. And that really came out in the study. But I think the TLDR, the basic headline of the study, was that when we talked to South Asians who were about to receive palliative care, but what they thought of palliative care, they were very much fearful of the term. Like, they wanted to run away from it. Basically, this was not for them. This was something that was a very bad thing, and they wanted to avoid it. But when you asked them what they needed was an approach to healthcare and care that alleviated suffering. Well, guess what? That's what palliative care is, right? And so it showed us that a lot of the times the way we present palliative care in our healthcare systems is a one-size-fits-all approach, which is probably like a Eurocentric kind of approach that does not kind of really meet the needs of culturally diverse communities. And there's a lot of literature to show, how we're introducing palliative care to Black people or Asians, or Hispanic and Latino populations as well, that we are kind of missing the boat. And so we have to customize our approach to explaining things, just like we customize our approach to care. Our South Asian families are viewing palliative care as if something is being taken away. So, they're introducing palliative care. That means no more chemo. That means no more dialysis. That means no more XYZ. And that's actually not the situation, although that's how it's being perceived, right? In fact, what I try to really train, particularly my South Asian families, to see it as is actually a set of tools, equipment, like sometimes literal equipment in the home, but I mean a suite of tools to actually support you and your family through a journey, and an extra layer of support. Everything from home and community care to having a nurse come to your home, to having health professionals assess your pain and symptom management, to spiritual care, to counseling, to anything and everything in between. And so where I've seen conflict happen is because maybe we didn't do the best job that we could have in introducing it as a suite of tools that add rather than take away. And I know that's a fairly simple concept, but that's where I feel like the root of a lot of issues lie in many of the much of the discourse I've kind of had.
I had some pretty potent experiences with people I loved in our Indian community that died. And what I've found, and actually the Lancet article, there's this 40-page commission paper. If you haven't checked it out, you can look it up. And it's the Lancet's one of the oldest journals in the world, and they came out with a 40-page commission paper called "The Value of Death: Bringing Death Back to Life," and it's all about kind of realizing that death is a natural phenomenon. It's not a medical event. It's a social, spiritual, relational experience. And so they even talked about how in India, there's so much faith in technology now and so much faith in Western medicine, to the point where death has changed even in the last 20 years in our Indian culture, abroad. And so I would say that faith and trust in technology and the medical model, the biomedical model, has really informed how we approach death. So the three people I love dearly, in our culture, everybody's auntie and uncle. They're dear friends and family friends. But one of them specifically came to me knowing I was a med student, and he knew I was interested in hospice at the time. And he told me, he said, I am so tired of chemo, so tired of fighting, quote unquote, that battle metaphor. And yet I can't stop. I can't stop doing this because Auntie won't allow it. She just can't accept the fact that I could be dying. And so they just didn't even talk about it. And so the deaths, that's one example of the death that kind of the dying process that I experienced. And he ended up dying in the ICU, fighting for life, at all costs. And then another uncle that I really loved, I just one day heard he died. And I couldn't believe it. I didn't know he was ill. There's a hush hush, very quiet and secretive. And I don't judge it. I just wonder if there was less death phobia and more normalization of death in our communities, if it would have been different.
I think those are some important points. I would also just basically say that we probably have to start at a place where we recognize that the systems that we've designed do not adequately meet the needs of racialized people. These these were systems that were not designed for people like us and our families. And although now you and I work in these kinds of health systems, they're certainly not meant to service our families and our loved ones in that way. And that's an important first step, because then it leads you down various tracks to think about. The research study that I talked about just shows like how we talk about palliative care needs to be different for different cultures and different people from different backgrounds. And in some cultures, in some languages, did you know that is not even a term, palliative care, that actually translates? So how do you actually talk about palliative care to someone from a culture who speaks a language where there actually isn't the term there? It also has to do with like how we assess pain and symptom management. For example, there's this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but certain kinds of pain syndromes that I was taught to diagnose, like nerve pain, for example, or neuropathic pain. I was taught that if the person I'm caring for uses certain words, like burning or shooting or lancinating or electric, like this is an evidence of neuropathic pain. But my South Asian aunties, like in Brampton, Ontario, never said that when I was providing palliative care, and like that didn't mean they didn't have neuropathic pain, right? And so what we know is we underdiagnose, and therefore we undertreat certain kinds of pain in certain populations. Again, this has been shown to be true in Black North Americans and Hispanic Latino studies as well. And so, that has a lot to do with it. And then it also has to do with the way we design the facilities within which we support care, whether it's a hospice, whether it's a long-term care facility, whether it's assisted living communities, that they need to be not just culturally tolerant, they need to be culturally safe. And that means we have to actually train our health workers and our social care workers about the diversity of experiences that people have in hospice palliative care. And that ultimately means, being trauma informed in how we approach, the care that we provide. So I think we have a lot of work to do in hospice palliative care to make this beautiful thing that I know is an incredible thing, more accessible for South Asians and other racialized people across North America and around the world. So when thinking about our South Asian community, how can caregivers really improve communication to support their loved ones within the context of their healthcare teams? I have many people who say to me, "What should I ask my doctor the next time I see them, or the next time the home care nurse comes by, or when the home care coordinator calls, or whatever? What should I be saying so that my loved one gets the care they need, given that they English is a second language, it's not their culture per se?" What advice do you have?
I think kind of being okay with asking for help. I think that's a big one culturally. That what I've seen is that people think they have to, individuals that I know, and I don't know about the studies, what they show, but that collectively we feel that we have to do this alone. And I don't think that, I was just talking to my aunties yesterday, I was in Augusta, and they were saying that came from immigrating to the States. That's not how they did it and do it in India. Maybe now more so. Nursing homes are popping up in India, and there's more care given at the end of life in the final days now in some cities. So I think just humility and acknowledging, asking for help when you need it. I would say that. And then acknowledging that you can't do it all alone. It takes a community. It takes a village. Just like it takes a village to raise children, it takes a village to support a loved one in their home.
I grew up in Canada. I've been living in the US for more than 32 years. I just lost my father in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He waited for me. I got back and he did wait for me. When I entered the room, I remember how my brother and my mom were just paralyzed. They didn't know what to do, how to be. And I don't know if with a background with my own healthcare provision and just my own spiritual journey, I just said, we need music. I think Howard just mentioned something about kirtan. I said, if our father is going to transition, then we have to give him some opportunity to transition beautifully on this journey and give him a lot of support. And one of the things, the chaplain came in the next morning. I got to spend his last 17 hours with him. I'm so grateful. And it was very sacred. I must tell you. Not everyone can be prepared for this. I wasn't, but I think my brother and my mom were even less so. But what I did know is to be present and to provide an environment of support for my father as he transitioned. One of the most helpful things was the chaplain and the palliative nurse the next morning before my father passed and after he died. They were amazing. They were not of South Asian descent, but they were extremely knowledgeable across the board as to how to help us with this transition. And even the chaplain prayed with us and gave a very universal prayer that was very powerful. He also said that the last sense to leave the human physicality is the sense of hearing. So we were fortunate to be able to be present, speaking with my father and playing those beautiful kirtans and the chanting and so on. But my ultimate question is, in our communities, how is it that our palliative care staff, knowledgeable people like our chaplains and maybe palliative care nurses, how can they speak to our communities so that we can prepare for the most inevitable thing, which is death, to help us work our way through it, to understand it can be a sacred process, and to take away maybe some of the I guess stigmas and fear that often surrounds that. Is that something that's being done now? And if not, then how do we help for that to occur? Because the resources are in place, and I'm ever so grateful for those resources. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarmita. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to answer really bluntly to say that actually, our systems are not doing a great job of meeting the needs of racialized people in North America, particularly when it comes to palliative care. And I'm going to go as far as to say that this is a manifestation of not race, but racism. This is a manifestation of systemic racism within our healthcare systems. And I think that the fact that we're having this conversation is a manifestation of that it requires us to have a table talk about this topic. And so I think, you've hit on some of the really huge points that we're not going to get anywhere unless, our systems are better equipped to have these kinds of conversations. I think one thing that's really important is representation. I always say that representation is not anti-racism. It's not going to reverse the effects or alleviate the effects of systemic racism, but it is important. Like, it was really nice when, my South Asian family see a South Asian doctor or a nurse, who kind of understands where they're coming from. It can be helpful. It's something. I also think, when we're using tools in Canada, we use the Edmonton Symptom Assessment Score, but you'd be hard pressed to, find that tool in, translated in multiple languages. That's surprising given how diverse Canada is. It's mostly just offered in English to coast to coast, and I think this is true in the United States as well. So the tools that we use to assess. Also, like how we are introducing home and community care. Like, we talked about it a few times as this layer of support, but not this like we're giving up and so we're throwing these resources at you kind of thing is really important. And then the last thing, and I've talked about it a few times, I think is just like there is this perception that certain people in our communities are more apt to send their loved ones to long-term care, whereas I think certain culturally diverse communities, it's part of the culture to keep your loved one at home, and if you don't do that, that's a failure. And so we have to do better. Just like I'm saying that that's what the culture often says, and we need to do better to support people who want to keep their loved ones at home, and to do better to support those cultures or the people from those cultures where they tried and it didn't work. We don't want them to feel like it's a failure either, right?